Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 14 in Genesis chapter 39, and we'll just read verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. In our last study, we went to the New Testament in order to look at a verse that has a lot to do with what we're reading here, and that was in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5, starting in verse 25, and I'll read it again. Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. And as I mentioned in the last study, prison has the idea of it's a place where a lawbreaker goes. And according to the law that was broken, the degree of the crime would depend on the sentence that the lawbreaker receives. And then he is sent to prison, and there he must carry out the sentence. He must be there for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or a lifetime, whatever the judge determines. And that is why God uses prison as a figure of his wrath. Because in prison, the prisoner is paying for the crime. And of course, we can see and understand how that fits in with God's whole judgment program, because God has given the law, and man has broken the law, and man is a lawbreaker, and then God sentences the man to pay the penalty, and the penalty for breaking the law of God is death. And yet, Joseph is thrown into prison. He wasn't executed, but because he's in prison, God can paint the picture that he is a type and figure of the Lord Jesus Christ, who, remember, we read in the previous verse, Potiphar, his wrath was kindled, and he was typifying God himself. And so Joseph in prison is basically receiving the wrath of his master Potiphar, historically, pointing to Christ receiving the wrath of God the Father when he entered into the world and from the Garden in Gethsemane to the cross, the 3 days and 3 nights, he was actually experiencing the wrath of God, although he was bearing no sin. And that's an important distinction. Christ experienced the wrath of God. He truly suffered, in other words, when he was in the garden, drinking of the cup of God's wrath, and he was in an agony with great drops of sweat as blood falling from him to the ground. And so that wasn't acting. That was Christ truly suffering. And yet Jesus was innocent. He had no sin upon him, because all the sin of his people had already been paid for at the foundation of the world. And that's one thing we can see very clearly with Joseph. Joseph is innocent of the charge that Potiphar's wife laid against him. And actually, so, it was a false accusation concerning the Lord Jesus Christ. They found fault with him without a cause. They had no legitimate reason to bring him before the Jewish council, nor to turn him over to the Roman authorities for the crucifixion. Well, going back here to Matthew 5, agree with thine adversary quickly, and we saw the adversary of the sinner, the one who's in his sins, is God himself. God required agreement. And I went into some detail how that was, and we went to Psalm 51, and we saw how the Lord moved David to say, for I acknowledge my transgressions against thee. He was not fighting the charge. He was not claiming innocence. He was not trying to justify his actions, but full agreement. You are right, oh God, I am guilty. I did commit this sin of adultery. I did commit this sin of murder. I am guilty and I don't deserve anything. That is what God is saying here as far as agreeing with your adversary quickly whilst thou art in the way, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer. And I mention, and it goes on to say, and thou deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. And I mentioned how perfectly that identifies with Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh who cast Joseph into prison. Well, there's another verse in Luke, similar verse. And so why don't we take a look at that? In Luke chapter 12, in verse 58, it says, when thou goest with thine adversary to the magistrate, as thou art in the way, give diligence that thou mayest be delivered from him, lest he hale thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and the officer cast thee into prison. I tell thee, thou shalt not depart thence till thou hast paid the very last mite. Notice there's an emphasis, the officer will throw you into prison. Now the word prison, the Greek word prison, which is phileki, is how I would pronounce it. It's Strong's number 5438. And it's also found in Revelation 20. Revelation 20 concerning Satan's casting into the bottomless pit. So I'll read Revelation 20 starting in verse 2. And it says there, and he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. Now, notice the word bound, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that, he must be loosed a little season. So Satan is bound and shut up, and we can see relationship to a prison, but it's in a bottomless pit, and the bottomless pit represents hell. It represents the grave and death. Of course, it was a spiritual condition as far as he was concerned, and nonetheless, God is linking the bottomless pit to prison. Well, maybe seeing the words bound and shut up is not enough for you. So go down to verse 7 of Revelation 20. We were told after Satan was cast into the bottomless pit and shut up for 1,000 years until that was fulfilled, then he would be loosed a little season. In verse 7, we read, and when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. This is the same word prison that was in Matthew 5, 25 and 26, and Luke 12, verse 58. So that means the bottomless pit is a prison. It's a prison that was holding Satan. And that would give us some additional information about a prison. And for one thing, it tells us a prison does not have to be a literal place. It can be a condition. And Satan, while he was in prison over the course of the church age, and we can prove that from the Bible, upon his loosing is when he rose up and killed the two witnesses in Revelation 11, and the church age came to an end. But he was wandering about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Over the course of the church age, the very time God says he was in a prison. And that's because it was a spiritual condition. The bottomless pit is a figure of hell. If we go to 2 Peter chapter 2, speaking of the fallen angels in verse 4, for if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. You see, delivered to chains of darkness, just as it said in Revelation 20, but cast into a bottomless pit there. Here, it's said to be hell. Well, that means the bottomless pit and hell are likened to prison, and that helps us again in our understanding of Potiphar, a figure of God whose wrath is kindled, throwing Joseph into prison, a type of Christ. What can prison represent? The condition of hell, the condition of being in a bottomless pit and under the wrath of God. So it strengthens that idea. But also, if we go to Revelation 9, we'll see the word bottomless pit again. In Revelation 9, the first two verses, it says there, and the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And that's Christ. Christ has the keys of hell and death. And remember, we just saw the bottomless pit is hell. So Christ has the keys of the bottomless pit. He has the key of hell. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And the opening of the bottomless pit, years ago, Mr. Camping thought this identified with the loosing of Satan and the judgment on the churches and congregations. But more thorough, careful Bible study, and of course, God graciously opening up our eyes and fine-tuning our ability to understand these things, has revealed that no, this opening of the bottomless pit takes place on Judgment Day, May 21, 2011. That this is the first of the three woes, all really simultaneous. The three woes identify with the last three trumpets, and the first four trumpets sounded in chapter 8, and the last verse of Revelation 8, verse 13, declared, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet. And that pinpoints this as far as the judgment on the world with the language to the inhabitants of the earth, which we could tie into Jeremiah 25. But anyway, when the bottomless pit is open, Christ opens the pit, and out of the pit comes a smoke that is like a great furnace, and the sun and air are darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. In other words, the condition that was in the pit, and that was a smoky condition because of a great furnace, the wrath of God likened to horrible fire, and also the darkness, as I don't know how God does it, but sometimes he'll picture his wrath as flaming fire. Other time, he'll picture his wrath as outer darkness, and they're picturing the same thing. And so the smoke and darkness and furnace that were down below, so to speak, in the bottomless pit, are loosed and brought to the surface when the Lord Jesus Christ opens the pit. In other words, what happens is that the earth takes upon itself the same condition as the bottomless pit. The things that were once in the bottomless pit, the smoke, the great furnace, the darkness, are now above. They've risen and turned the earth into hell. They've turned the earth into the bottomless pit. And that's the reason we've talked about this before in Psalm 9. I'll go back there just to read this verse. God declares in Psalm 9, verse 17, "The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God." The wicked will be turned into hell or the grave. That Sheol could be read either way, and grave and hell mean the same thing. And so does the bottomless pit. So does the bottomless pit. And so the world became like the bottomless pit when God commenced his judgment process. And we know from the Bible, because the Bible has confirmed this, that Judgment Day began on the earth on May 21, 2011. That's when the pit was open and all the smoke arose and darkened the sun. Immediately after the tribulation, what happened to the sun? According to Matthew 24:29, the sun was darkened. It ties in because the tribulation lasted 23 years, 8,400 exact days to May 21, 2011. Immediately after, the pit is open and hell comes to the earth above, and the nations are turned into hell. And this is where we have been living, each one of us, day by day since that time. We are alive and remaining on the earth that is in the condition of hell, as we are, those of us who are truly saved, following God through this awful period of time, waiting to come up out of hell, to come up out of the womb of hell on the last day in the resurrection, just as the Lord Jesus Christ did, to be declared sons of God. Well, anyway, I wanted to mention that because if we go over to Revelation 18, we read in verse 2, "And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen. We're familiar with that. And historically, when did Babylon fall? After the 70 years. 70 years they were triumphant. What did that 70 years typify? It was God's judgment on Judah. That was a historical parable, a historical picture of the Great Tribulation judgment on the churches and congregations. Once the 70 years period expired, then Babylon fell, the very night. And Daniel understood by books the time that Jeremiah had said concerning the 70 years at that point. And so here, when Babylon falls, we can pinpoint the date. May 21, 2011, immediately after the tribulation, Babylon, representing the kingdoms of this world, the kingdom of Satan, falls because Christ has taken the kingdom. Christ is victorious. Satan is defeated. And again, we've gone into that quite a bit. But what I want us to notice is what is said next. Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. The Greek word translated prison is translated as hold and cage. So, in other words, we could read this: Babylon the Great is fallen, has become the habitation of devils, and the prison of every foul spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Babylon, the world, that's what it typifies. The whole kingdom of Satan, all the kingdoms, all the nations of this world are his kingdom. They are Babylon. The world is fallen. The world has become a prison of every foul spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird, because the world has been turned into hell. The world is now in the condition of the bottomless pit, and so the wrath of God is upon the world. That's the main point that we can gather from that. And that's what we see back in Genesis 39, when Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, and not gently, but he was full of wrath, because it is a picture of experiencing the wrath of God, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. The world has been turned into this prison that God warned about in those verses, Matthew 5:25, agree with your adversary quickly, and in Luke 12:58. And here we are, the people of God, making an appearance before the judgment seat of Christ, and we're going through these very same circumstances, yet in a similar way as Joseph, because there's no sin upon us. There's no guilt upon us. And so God is finding no fault in us, and he will bring us out. But those who have sin upon them, they must pay the very last mite. They must pay the penalty in full. And that penalty is death. Their prison stay will finalize and conclude with the second death, their everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord.
Thank you for joining us for E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.